Welcome to another best wildcard video ahead of game week 34. Chelsea and Man United are going to be doubling, and that will change a few things from the last wildcard team we showed you in game week 32. So let's get straight into this. What hasn't changed from the last video is having Schmeichel and Foster as the goalkeepers, and if you look until the end of the season, there aren't too many standouts. I've talked about this before. Ramsdale has dipped dramatically. Arsenal just look like they can't even win a single game. So I think Schmeichel is the best. He's 4.9 million now. He even got a bonus point despite conceding 2 goals to Newcastle the other day. And which other goalkeepers could you consider? Maybe Martinez, because Villa have a few doubles left and some good fixtures. And the other one is Nick Pope, because once again, plenty of doubles, at least in 36, and also some good fixtures. So those are the only other keepers that I would consider. But Schmeichel for me is just a standout. And even then, he's not the greatest choice. Leicester still have only kept 5 clean sheets all season. So as I talked about in the transfer tips video where I broke down the stats for Leicester, they're not great, the underlying numbers, but I'd still just go for Schmeichel because the rest don't look that good. It's as simple as that. Foster's the second goalkeeper. I don't think it's worth going for Dubravka, although he's still a good option, especially in game week 34 and also around game week 37, 38. But the fixtures in 35 around that time, against City and Liverpool are awful, and either way you'd probably be benching him anyway, so Foster could just be there as your second goalkeeper, and that's that. So let's move on to the defence now, and let me know what you think of this. This may come as a bit of a surprise, but I've only gone for 1 Chelsea defender. You can go for 2. I'll talk about this a little bit later on. There are a few alternatives to this team, but I would just go for 1. I think that's fair enough, and you can triple up with Chelsea with 2 midfielders. I think in the long term, 2 is the sweet spot, but there's nothing wrong with having 3 Chelsea players. I've gone for Rudiger because Reece James is playing as a right centre-back, and it's Ruben Loftus-Cheek who is being deployed as the right wing-back. He scored in the FA Cup semi-final against Crystal Palace, and that worries me a little bit. Reece James isn't as nailed as Rudiger, and he's now playing as a right centre-back. So what is really the big difference between the two? At the moment, I think Rudiger's just more nailed, and therefore he's the better option. Both similar attacking threat if they both play as a centre-back. But Reece James, if he does get played as a right wing-back once again, then of course he can cause some real damage, and he has a lot of upside, the most by far of any Chelsea defender. There's also Marcos Alonso, who's an interesting option at 5.5 million, and he's been in good form recently. Would I go for Alonso and Reece James? Probably not. I would go for 1 nailed defender and then possibly one of those wing backs if you were doubling up on the defence. But I think Rudiger's just enough, and you don't need to go for a double up. Their double in game week 34 isn't the greatest anyway from a defensive point of view. I wouldn't be surprised if they considered to West Ham and Manchester United. So having 1 I think is fair enough. I think a double up in Liverpool defence is actually just a better option. They have by far the most attacking potential, and Liverpool are in the form of their life. They look like the best team in the world at the moment. And if you look at João Cancelo, he is in my opinion the best Manchester City player, at least from an FPL perspective. But if you can go for Laporte, and that extra money will go a long way in improving the rest of your team, then I would just go for Laporte. I think there isn't as big of a difference between those two, Laporte and Cancelo, as there is with Konate or Van Dijk with those Liverpool fullbacks. That's why I've gone for these 2 Liverpool fullbacks and João Cancelo. But once again, if you can do a lot with that extra money, just go for Laporte, and you don't need João Cancelo. Anderson is there as the 5th defender. Other defenders would include Emerson Royal if you want someone around a similar price. But Crystal Palace have been one of the better teams defensively all season, and they have some good fixtures until the end of the campaign. There's always Matty Cash, who's going to have some good doubles as well as very good fixtures, so he could be your 5th defender. It just depends on your budget as well. But ultimately, I think I would go for a defensive 5 like this. The only difference would be maybe a downgrade in the midfield, and therefore you can get Reece James in for Anderson and go very big at the back. But I think 4 is enough, having 4 relatively expensive defenders and 1 somewhat cheaper option. But let me know what you think, and now let's move on to the midfielders. There are many midfielders to choose from, and it's impossible to fit them all in, of course, but I've gone for Mason Mount. I think if I had to pick 1 Chelsea midfielder, and I'll talk about this in the transfer tips video as well, I think I would go for Mason Mount at the moment. He's been in fine form. He scored in 3 consecutive games in the FA Cup, the Premier League, and also the Champions League. Kai Havertz has also been in very good form for the last 5 or 6 games, but I think Mason Mount in the last 3 matches has shown his class, and he's a bit more appealing. He's also slightly cheaper, but you can't go wrong with either. So take your pick there if you decide to go the double up in the defence instead, and you don't want to have both of them and you have to choose between the 2. I think they're both great options, but I would personally go for Mason Mount at the moment with the form he's in. Of course, form doesn't always last, and Havertz could then overtake him in the next few games, but I think both of them are really good, and both great captaincy options as well, even over the likes of Salah, who has a great single game week fixture against Everton. Now, you could go for Diego Jota instead instead of Salah, you don't necessarily need the Egyptian, but I still think Salah is going to come good. Hopefully he proves that in Game Week 33 against Manchester United. He is my captain in Game Week 33, which is a bit of a surprise. But in Game Week 34 against Everton, you would expect Salah and Liverpool to destroy them, especially if they, don't take their foot off the gas. We've got double Spurs attack. And would I go for a triple up in Spurs attack at the moment? Well, it's still a viable option. But as I said, I think in the long term, 2 is the sweet spot. I still think they have a great attack, one of the best in the league, but I wouldn't go for a triple up. So I'd go for Son and Kulusevski. If you have the means and the funds, then you could go for Kane up front. But who would you downgrade in order to get that? Would you downgrade Salah, Son? It's up to you. But I think I would go for a midfield 5 like this. I still think Kulusevski offers better value around his price and below than any midfielder in the entire game. And Son is so consistent. He's got 17 goals and 8 assists this season. Absolutely remarkable. And only Salah is ahead of him in the Golden Boot race, as well as points amongst midfielders. So I would go for a midfield 5 like this, but there's always Maddison as well, who's a great option until the end of the season. I'm just very concerned with the Europa Conference League and the rotation from Leicester, and that's why I didn't get Maddison in the end for Game Week 33, which was my original plan, and I wanted to captain him, but I just didn't expect him to start both games. He was benched against Newcastle, which wasn't really too much of a surprise, but he is still a very good option. Other good midfielders include Kevin De Bruyne, if you want a premium that isn't Salah. There's always Zaha, who's got great fixtures for Palace. If you want to go there, I don't think that's a bad option at all. And there's also a few others like Phil Foden, but I just haven't been convinced with Manchester City attackers recently. Manchester City aren't in the greatest of form, and Foden has blanked in the last 4 or 5 game weeks. Of course, that could change, especially against Watford. But I don't think you necessarily need Phil Foden or any City attacker, to be honest. But of course, that could still be a really good differential and a boost for your rank. But I think this midfield 5 is just fine. And now let's move on to the forwards. A very different looking front 3 compared to the usual. I always talk about having Harry Kane no matter what on your wildcard, your free hit or free transfers. And I still think he's a great option. He hasn't scored in the last few games, but he's still been producing a lot of assists. He was pretty poor against Brighton, but so were the rest of the Spurs team. And I would mainly blame Antonio Conte for the tactics he deployed. Kane didn't drop deep once in that game, which is integral to Spurs' creativity and giving the likes of Son the spaces and the positions to just finish the chances there. I've gone for Pukki though. I haven't talked about him enough, I think, and that's probably a mistake of mine. He has been quietly going about his business. He's one of the best performing strikers this season. Not saying much, but around 5.9 million, that is an absolute bargain. He does play in arguably the worst team in the league, but Pukki has been just under the radar, and he also doubles in 36. Remember, I talked about this in my last team selection video. I don't have a striker that doubles in 36 or someone that I really trust, even Weghorst after his 8 points in Game Week 33, but I think Pukki would be the ideal double Game Week 36 striker. He's got some decent fixtures until the end of the season, and even when he faces someone like Manchester United, which would be a 4 on the FDR and marked red as a difficult fixture, he can still produce. I've gone for Mateta. He's also a cheap enabler, and the same goes for Gelhardt, who would pretty much sit on your bench every single week, even in double Game Week 36 potentially when he does have that double. But I think this is probably the front 3 to go for. There's always Ivan Toney, who's been in great form despite his 1 point in Game Week 33, and Harry Kane. He is still a fantastic option. Other than these 5, so the 3 you see on screen and the 2 I just mentioned, there's not many other options I would consider up front. Even Iheanacho, who doubles in 36 and 37. But let me know, what would you change with this team? And now I'm going to show you how we would line up in Game Week 34 and also how this would line up in Game Week 35 and 36. Just a brief overview. You can always make some transfers to improve things. And in Game Week 37, if you still have your free hit, I think this wildcard team is definitely the ideal scenario for you. We'd line up with a 4-5-1 formation. Schmeichel would be in goal. It isn't ideal, but we don't have the Jose Sars and Ramsdales right now, who are in great form for the first half of the season. But Schmeichel at home to Aston Villa, maybe there could be a clean sheet there. Villa haven't been in the greatest of form themselves, but I wouldn't really expect a clean sheet for Leicester there, to be honest. Then we've got Antonio Rudiger with a double, of course. You could even captain him. The same goes for Reece James or Alonso. But I would slightly favour the midfielders, whether it's Kai Havertz or Mason Mount, because the fixtures from a defensive point of view, as I said earlier, aren't exactly the greatest. Double Liverpool defence at home to Everton, as well as Salah, who's probably the best captaincy option from the single game weekers, and Joao Cancelo at home to Watford. That looks very solid. And then you look at the rest of the midfield, Heung-min Son and Kulusevski away to Brentford, who have been in decent form, to be fair. but Spurs you would still expect to score a few goals past them. And then Pukki up front at home to Newcastle. And then you look at the bench, it's pretty solid with Mateta and Anderson at home to Leeds. Gelhardt doesn't really matter, but he's away to Crystal Palace. They're obviously facing each other. Foster facing Man City away. But having Mateta and Anderson on the bench just shows you that it's got good squad depth. But then we look at Game Week 35, which isn't going to be at the forefront of our discussions and thoughts, but we look at Game Week 35. Schmeichel away to Tottenham looks pretty poor. You could even arguably go for Foster at home to Burnley instead. And then 4 defenders once again with Cancelo, Trent, Robertson and Rudiger. Nothing changes there. And then double Chelsea midfield against Everton. That could be pretty good there with plenty of points. Salah or Son could be your captain. Newcastle away and Leicester at home, both good fixtures. And then you've got Kulusevski at home to Leicester. By the way, if you have Harry Kane still, I think he'd be a great captaincy option against Leicester. Pukki away to Aston Villa, but you could play Mateta instead away to Southampton. The team doesn't look as strong in Game Week 35, but still pretty good nonetheless. And then Game Week 36, we have got 11 doublers, 10 in the starting 11, Gelhardt on the bench, but you wouldn't really bench Cancelo at home to Newcastle for Gelhardt or any of these Crystal Palace players. Even Foster's got a double actually, so that's 12. But I would go for something like this with Salah as your captain and Son as your vice. But you could even captain one of those Chelsea players instead. And having Pukki, I think he's a great option for Double Game Week 36 and the rest of the season. But let me know what you think of these captaincy plans for Game Week 34. Who is your captain going to be? Is it going to be Mason Mount, Kai Havertz, Reece James, or just a single Game Week player like Mohamed Salah? Let me know. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, smash the like button and subscribe if you're new. Consider joining us on Patreon or as a channel member to get exclusive early access to all my videos as well as a whole list of different perks. So check it out. I think you'll be interested. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram, DylanRCM. So all the very best of luck for Game Week 34 and the rest of the season. I'm always interested to see your thoughts. There's a Discord server where you can also do the same as well as Twitter and Instagram. So be sure to check that out in the description below. Take care, enjoy the football, and I'll see you next time.